In the last section, we got a quick overview of how this course is organized, and we ended up saying that we'll first do a deep dive into the Dart language itself, and then eventually shift over to studying Flutter. Before we move on to our first application, I want to give you a quick overview of Dart itself, so that you have some more context on the language. So let's take a look at a diagram that's going to summarize a few important concepts about Dart. So in this diagram, we're going to take a look at 4 different important features of Dart. First off, Dart is an object-oriented programming language. With an object-oriented language, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to model logic in our application using objects. In Dart, objects are referred to as classes. If you've never worked with an object-oriented programming language before, or don't know what the term class refers to, that's completely okay. We're going to do a deep dive on object-oriented programming inside this course. Second, Dart is a statically typed language, similar to C++, C#, or Java. For reference, languages like, say, JavaScript or Ruby are examples of dynamically typed languages. We will, of course, discuss static typing quite a bit throughout this course, but for now, just imagine that in Dart, we have to make sure that any given variable can only contain data of a single type, like, say, an integer or a string. If you've never worked with a statically typed language before, or if you feel a little bit intimidated by types, I really recommend you not worry one bit. The type system in Dart is extremely flexible for beginners. Third, Dart has a C-style syntax. So in general, it's going to look very similar to C, C# or JavaScript or even Java. You will probably not be seeing a lot of strange symbols inside your code. Most of the code that you and I are going to write is going to look quite legible in my personal opinion. Finally, Dart has multiple runtime environments. That means to say that we can somehow execute Dart code in the browser, from our command line, or with mobile apps. When ran in the browser, Dart first gets transpiled into plain JavaScript code, and we will see a good example of this in one of the apps that we're going to work on later in the course. When ran from the command line as a standalone program, Dart is executed in something called the Dart VM, or the Dart virtual machine. Finally, on a mobile device, Dart is first compiled into machine code. So your mobile device doesn't ever touch a snippet of pure Dart, it works directly with machine code. Okay, so in this section we got a very high level view on a couple of different aspects of Dart. Let's now continue in the next section and start working on our first tiny little application. In the last section we spoke about a few important notes on the Dart programming language. We're now going to continue by pulling up an online code editor intended to make getting started with Dart very easy and straightforward. So we're going to be using a tool called DartPad. This is a browser-based tool for playing around with Dart. You'll notice that I highlighted or underlined playing around on here. DartPad is not for use for professional projects or anything like that. It's really just a tool to help you get started with the language and play around with very small snippets of code. We can access DartPad by going to dartpad.dartlang.org. So I'm going to open up a new tab inside my browser and I'll navigate there right now. So I'll go to dartpad.dartlang.org. Now once here, you're going to see a couple of different panels on the screen. You'll see some code pre-generated on the left-hand side. So this is code that you and I can write and edit. Then on the right-hand side, you'll see one panel up here towards the top right that's going to eventually show us some output from Dart code that we run. And then on the bottom right-hand side will be some information about the code that we're working on. Now one quick thing I want to mention, you might notice that my DartPad right here looks a little bit different from yours. So in particular, you might notice that you have a footer at the bottom, and I don't. And you might notice that I have a very subtle or faint outline around every line of code over here. These are some very small CSS changes that I made to DartPad on my browser alone, just so that you can more easily see the code that I'm working on inside this course. So if your copy of DartPad looks just a little bit different, don't sweat it, that's totally fine. To use DartPad, we're going to end up writing code on the left-hand side and then clicking on the Run button at the very top up here. If I click it right now, it will execute the code that you see on the left-hand side, and we'll see some output appear on the right-hand side. In addition, if I say click on this main word right here, you'll see a tiny snippet of information on the bottom right about that little chunk of code. So we're going to be using several different features inside of DartPad to get a better handle on the code that we're writing. Now let's take a pause right now. We're going to come back in the next section and start talking about our first little snippet of Dart code that you and I are going to write together.